Wild donkeys often start out avoiding people. They might leave, they might freeze, they might create as much distance as possible. That's normal. But over time, donkeys can learn very specific ways to avoid pressure. Not because they're being stubborn, but because at some point, that response worked for them. They felt pressure, they backed away, they found relief. And little by little, that response can turn into a pattern. What I want to show you in this video is how those patterns begin and why it's much easier to prevent them than it is to fix them later. Because most people don't notice avoidance until it's already become a habit, but it usually starts much earlier than that. Right here, I'm introducing Squirrel to the halter. And what you'll notice is that at a certain point when the halter comes into the picture, he starts to think about backing away. Now, that doesn't mean he's being stubborn, and it doesn't mean he's trying to be difficult. What it means is he's looking for an answer that helps him feel more comfortable. The halter creates a little uncertainty, and Squirrel's response to that uncertainty is distance. He backs up, he creates space. He tries to put more room between himself and the thing he's unsure about. That's very normal response for a wild donkey. But this is also the moment where I could have to be careful. Because if backing up becomes the thing that constantly brings relief, then backing up can become the answer. And once the donkey discovers an answer that works, they'll often keep using it. Not because they're trying to challenge us, but because from their point of view, it makes sense. If I feel pressure, I back away, I feel better. Why wouldn't I try that again? So when I'm working through something like the halter acceptance, I'm paying attention to much more than whether the halter goes on. I'm paying attention to what the donkey is learning about pressure. Because sometimes the biggest lesson happening in the moment isn't the halter after all. It's whether avoidance is becoming the answer to the question. Donkeys are always learning something. The question is whether they're learning the lesson we intended. Tony has taught me a lot about how avoidance can start becoming part of the donkey's answer. Now, Tony is much more willing than some of the other donkeys I've worked with. He's curious, he's interested, and most of the time, he generally wants to participate. But when he becomes uncertain, one of his go-to responses is backing up. When something feels uncomfortable, when he's not quite sure about the answer, he creates distance. And that's important because backing up can start working for him. Not in a dramatic way, not all at once. Just little moments where uncertainty shows up and distance brings relief. And that's how patterns begin. The challenge isn't that Tony backs up. The challenge is making sure that backing up doesn't become the answer to every question. Because once the donkey starts believing distance solves the problem, they'll keep trying to create distance. And the more successful that strategy becomes, the stronger the pattern gets. So I'm working with Tony. I'm not focused on stopping him from moving. I'm focused on helping him stay in the conversation, helping him realize that comfort can come from finding the answer, not from escaping the question. Because if we're careful at this stage, we can help build confidence before avoidance becomes a much bigger habit. With Tony, that didn't mean I jumped immediately into tying him up. In fact, I tried several different approaches first. At one point, I was using oats as pay. The oats helped him keep interested in the lesson and willing to come back into the conversation. But something interesting started to happen. Tony became so focused on the oats that sometimes he wasn't slowing down enough to process what was actually being asked of him. He wanted the reward. He wanted to participate. But wanting something and understanding something aren't always the same thing. A donkey can be willing, a donkey can be motivated, and they can still need more time to think. When I stopped using oats, another piece of the puzzle became clear. Instead of working through the question, Tony would often choose to leave and go stand by Dan, who happened to be working with another donkey nearby with oats. That told me the issue wasn't really about its feet. The issue was finding comfort in the situation. Eventually, I decided to tie him up while working through his foot handling, not because I wanted to force the answer, but because I didn't want backing away to become the answer. And once leaving wasn't an option, something interesting happened. He settled. He slowed down. And he started looking for comfort in the lesson instead of comfort in the escape. Before long, he was allowing me to pick up his feet by hand and finding peace in the process. The answer became easier than the avoidance. Richard took this idea even further. When we first started working together, his preferred answer wasn't backing away. His preferred answer was to shut down. He would go internal. He would stand there and pretend nothing was happening. He wouldn't engage with me. He wouldn't engage with his surroundings. He would simply disconnect from the conversation, and for a while that worked for him. But as his confidence improved and shutting down became less effective, he started looking for a different answer. That's when avoidance showed up. Instead of mentally leaving, he started physically leaving. If he became uncomfortable, he wanted distance. If he wasn't sure about something, he wanted out of the lesson. And over time, he became very committed to that answer, especially during groundwork. When we were working on clearing the fronts and building a circle, there were times where he became much more determined to evade the question than search for an answer. And because of that, I had to become much clearer and much more consistent than I would have preferred. Not because I wanted more pressure, but because I couldn't allow avoidance to become the lesson. Then, when we started working through more handling and footwork, another layer showed up. Richard began kicking. And if you've been following along with Richard's story, you know he wasn't kicking randomly. He was kicking with intention. Now, kicking is a serious issue, not because the donkey is bad, but because it's dangerous. And once the donkey believes kicking creates relief, that can become a very difficult pattern to change. So with Richard, the goal wasn't to punish the kicking. The goal was to help him find a better answer, to help him discover that comfort could come from understanding the lesson instead of escaping it. Because at that point, Richard was very committed to what had worked for him in the past. First he shut down, then he avoided, then he kicked. Those were the answers he trusted. And because he was so committed to those answers, it took much more time, much more consistency, and much more clarity to help him discover a different path. That's why I pay so much attention to avoidance when it first starts showing up, because it's much easier to prevent a pattern than it is to rebuild one after it becomes deeply rooted. What people often miss with avoidance is this. They think the donkey is refusing to learn. But when I look at Squirrel, Tony, and Richard, I don't see donkeys refusing to learn. I see donkeys searching for relief. Squirrel tried backing away from the halter. Tony tried backing away from pressure of uncertainty. Richard tried shutting down, then leaving, and eventually kicking, different behaviors, but the same goal. They're all trying to find comfort when they don't know the answer. And that's why I don't spend much time asking, how do I stop this behavior? Instead, I ask, what is the donkey learning works? Because if backing away works, they'll back away. If shutting down works, they'll shut down. If kicking works, they'll kick. Not because they're bad, not because they're stubborn, but because those answers brought relief. And when we understand that, we stop trying to win the moment. And we start helping the donkey discover a better answer instead. So when you see a donkey stepping away, backing up, shutting down, or reacting to pressure, it doesn't always mean they're refusing to learn. Most of the time, it just means they're trying to find an answer that brings them relief in the moment. And if that answer works even once, it can start to become a habit they reach for again. That's why I pay so much attention to these small moments early on, because this is where we're either building understanding or accidentally building avoidance. And once you start seeing it that way, everything changes. If you're still watching, thank you for being here and for caring enough to understand this deeper side of training. I also want to thank our channel members. Your support helps me to continue to document these real sessions with these real donkeys and share the process behind the decisions, not just the outcome. For those who want more support, we have a few ways to work together. Our gentling camps focus on the early foundation work: catching, haltering, leading, picking up feet, and trailer loading, the basics that everything else is built on. Our clinics go a step further into the groundwork: obstacles, timing, and communication, learning how to help donkeys stay in the conversation instead of stepping out of it. And for those who can't travel to Roundup, Montana, I also offer online coaching. You can send video of what you're working through with your donkey, and we do coaching calls to help you understand what your donkey is communicating with you and how to work through it in real time. No matter where you are in your journey, I appreciate you being part of this. I'll see you in the next one.